Sophie hadn't expected the call from her cousin Lila. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when her phone buzzed, the familiar name flashing across the screen. "Sophie, I know it's sudden, but I'd love for you to come stay for the weekend. It's been too long." Sophie hesitated at first. Her life in the city had been hectic, filled with endless meetings, crowded streets, and a sense of constant rush that left little room for rest. But the thought of escaping to the calm of Leela's house, tucked away in a small town, sounded like a dream she hadn't realized she needed. She agreed almost immediately, surprising herself with the eagerness she felt. The drive out of the city was refreshing. The noise and chaos of urban life slowly faded as she passed rolling hills and stretches of open fields. The air smelled fresher, cleaner, with a faint scent of pine and damp earth after a light rain. Sophie's mind wandered to memories of visiting Lila's house as a child, of laughter, the late-night stories, and the sense of safety she had always felt there. She wondered if that feeling could return, or if time had changed everything. Arriving at Lila's street, Sophie noticed how peaceful it was. The small houses were neatly kept, their gardens blooming with early spring flowers. Birds chirped in the trees, and there was a gentle breeze that carried a hint of something familiar, something almost nostalgic. Sophie parked in front of Lila's house and took a deep breath. She had almost forgotten how comforting this place could feel. Lila greeted her at the door, her arms open in a warm embrace. "Sophie, you made it," she said, her voice cheerful. But Sophie noticed a slight tension beneath the surface, a tightness in her shoulders and a nervous flicker in her eyes. Lila stepped back and looked at her cousin carefully, as if assessing how much she had changed over the past year. "You haven't changed a bit," she said, smiling, but her eyes betrayed a hint of worry. Sophie smiled back, though a small unease began to creep in. There was something different about Lila this time, something Sophie couldn't quite place. The house had changed subtly too. It was still cozy, with warm wooden furniture, soft rugs, and framed family photos lining the walls, but there was a quiet stillness, a calm that felt almost too deliberate. It wasn't unpleasant, just unfamiliar. Sophie set down her bag and took a moment to look around, noticing the little details. A vase of fresh flowers on the table, the smell of vanilla and cinnamon lingering in the air, and the soft flicker of candlelight from the living room. It was welcoming, but Sophie felt a strange undercurrent, a tension she couldn't explain. As she unpacked, Sophie's mind wandered. She thought about how much she had missed this place and her cousin's company. Yet, she couldn't shake that feeling that something was different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, an expectation of something that hadn't yet arrived. She tried to push it aside, focusing instead on settling in, placing her belongings neatly in the guest room, and smoothing the wrinkles from her clothes. Later, they sat by the fireplace, sipping tea. The warmth of the flames was comforting, and for a while the conversation flowed easily. They talked about Sophie's work, the mundane details of life, and shared old family stories that made them both laugh. Lila's laughter was familiar and bright, but Sophie noticed her eyes often drifting toward the window, watching for something or someone. Sophie wondered who she was expecting but didn't ask. The question felt too sudden, too intrusive, and yet it lingered at the edge of her thoughts. The hours passed quickly. Outside, the sky darkened, and rain began to fall in soft, steady drops. The sound of it against the windows was soothing, adding a rhythmic calm to the evening. Sophie felt a wave of relaxation wash over her, grateful for the chance to unwind. She thought about how rare it was to have a moment like this, free from deadlines, emails, and the constant pull of city life. Here, in Lila's home, she could breathe, think, and just be. But just as she began to settle fully into this comfort, the quiet was broken. The door to the living room opened slowly, and Sophie turned instinctively, a slight chill running down her spine. A young man stepped in. He was tall, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He smiled politely at them, but there was a strange intensity in his gaze, a curiosity that made Sophie's heart skip a beat. She didn't recognize him immediately, and yet there was something about him that felt oddly familiar. Leela's voice broke through Sophie's thoughts. "Sophie, this is my son, Ethan," she said softly, almost apologetically. Sophie blinked, momentarily stunned. She had no idea Lila had a son, and the revelation caught her completely off guard. She forced a smile, trying to mask her surprise, and extended a hand. Ethan shook it lightly, his expression polite but reserved. There was a quiet confidence in him, calm presence that somehow contrasted with the nervous energy Sophie felt in the room. The atmosphere shifted slightly. Sophie felt an undercurrent of tension, not unpleasant, but potent. It was the kind of tension that comes from unexpected encounters, from the collision of past familiarity and present uncertainty. She tried to make small talk, asking about school, hobbies, and interests, but Ethan's answers were brief, thoughtful, and measured. Every so often, he glanced at her in a way that made her feel seen, as though he were trying to understand her in a single look. Sophie's heart thudded with an unfamiliar mix of curiosity and apprehension. The evening wore on, and Sophie found herself sitting quietly, observing the subtle dynamics between mother and son. Lila seemed protective, almost cautious, while Ethan carried a quiet intensity, a depth that suggested more than just polite conversation. Sophie realized that she was drawn into a delicate balance, a world she had not anticipated entering. The warmth of the fire contrasted sharply with the electric tension in the room, a mix of comfort and uncertainty that made her pulse quicken. Eventually, Sophie excused herself to the guest room. The bed was neatly made, soft blankets inviting her to relax. She lay down for a moment, staring at the ceiling and letting her mind wander. She thought about Ethan, about the strange feelings he evoked, and about the subtle unease that had followed her since her arrival. There was something magnetic about him, something that both intrigued and unsettled her. She didn't understand it yet. She knew that the weekend would be unlike any other she had experienced. Sleep eluded her. She found herself replaying the moments of the evening in her mind. Lila's cautious glances, Ethan's measured words, the quiet, almost electric energy that hung between them. The house, so familiar and comforting in daylight, now felt alive with possibilities and questions. Sophie wondered what tomorrow would bring, what conversations she would have, and whether this strange connection she felt with Ethan would deepen or fade. Hours passed, and the sound of rain continued to patter against the windows. Sophie finally closed her eyes, letting the gentle rhythm lull her into a light, restless sleep. Dreams of laughter, conversations, and fleeting glances filled her mind, blending memories of childhood with the uncertainty of the present. She awoke briefly during the night, startled by the soft creak of a floorboard, but found nothing amiss. Yet the sense of anticipation remained, an invisible thread that tied her to the house, to Lila, and to Ethan in ways she could not yet name. Morning arrived slowly. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting warm patterns on the walls. Sophie dressed quietly, moving through the house with care, not wanting to disturb anyone. She prepared for breakfast, her mind still occupied with thoughts of the previous evening. The encounter with Ethan lingered in her mind like a whisper, subtle but persistent, urging her to explore the curiosity and tension she felt. When she joined Leela in the kitchen, the air was filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and baked bread. The atmosphere was lighter than the night before, yet there was still an unspoken awareness of the presence of someone new, someone whose arrival had shifted the balance of the household. Sophie smiled at her cousin, who returned it with a warm, though slightly wary, expression. Conversation flowed easily at first, but Sophie's attention kept drifting to the chair where Ethan had been sitting. Then, without warning, his voice called from the hallway, polite and calm, yet carrying a weight that made Sophie pause. "Sophie, can we talk?" The simple question was enough to make her heart skip again. She felt a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and an unexpected excitement. The weekend she had anticipated as a quiet escape now promised emotional complexity, subtle tension, and the beginning of connections she had never expected to encounter. The morning sun poured softly into the kitchen as Sophie stirred her coffee, trying to make sense of the whirlwind from the previous evening. The encounter with Ethan lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. She kept recalling the intensity in his eyes, the quiet confidence, and the strange pull she felt when he glanced her way. It was confusing, exhilarating, and yet, she told herself, it was simply curiosity, nothing more. Breakfast was calm at first. Lila moved around the kitchen efficiently, setting out plates of toast, scrambled eggs, and fresh fruit. Sophie helped, without thinking, her mind wandering as she listened to the rhythmic clinking of cutlery and the occasional soft hum from Lila. But every so often, her eyes flicked toward the doorway, half expecting Ethan to appear. When he finally did, it was almost startling. He walked in with a casual ease, carrying a tray of juice and a small loaf of bread he had picked up on his morning run. "Morning," he said simply, his voice low but warm. Sophie felt her pulse quicken at the sound. He set the tray down and offered her a small, polite smile. There was something about the way he moved, calm, deliberate, yet effortless, that made her notice him more than she wanted. He had a presence that filled the room without trying, a quiet energy that demanded attention. Sophie shifted slightly. In her seat, suddenly aware of her own heartbeat and the fluttering in her chest, Lila glanced at them, her expression a mix of amusement and caution. "Eat before it gets cold," she said lightly, but Sophie noticed the subtle tension in her tone. It wasn't reprimanding, just careful, protective. Sophie nodded, focusing on her plate, but she could feel Ethan's gaze lingering in her peripheral vision. Every time she looked up, their eyes met briefly, and each glance left her with an odd mix of warmth and nervousness. As they ate, conversation began cautiously. Ethan asked Sophie about her work, her hobbies, and the city she came from. His questions were simple, almost casual, but there was a depth to them, a curiosity that seemed to reach beyond the surface. Sophie answered honestly, trying to match his calm demeanor. But she couldn't help noticing the way he listened, truly listened. As though he wanted to understand not just her words, but the feelings behind them. It was both flattering and unsettling. Sophie wasn't used to people paying this kind of attention to her. Friends and colleagues often nodded politely, glanced at their phones, or waited for their turn to speak. But Ethan seemed genuinely interested, engaged, and thoughtful. She found herself smiling more than she intended, caught off guard by how easy it was to talk to him, despite the strange tension she still felt. After breakfast, Lila excused herself to handle some errands, leaving Sophie and Ethan alone in the sunlit kitchen. The air between them shifted immediately. It was lighter, but charged with something unspoken. A silent acknowledgement of the curiosity and connection that neither had fully named yet. Ethan leaned against the counter, arms folded casually. But his eyes never left Sophie's face. "I didn't expect you to come all this way," he said quietly. There was a softness to his tone that made Sophie's chest tighten. "I didn't think. I didn't know I'd actually get to meet you." Sophie blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I didn't know you existed until last night," she replied honestly, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her stomach. Lila never mentioned you." Ethan smiled faintly, a mixture of amusement and embarrassment crossing his face. "She's protective, understandably, but I think she wanted me to meet you." He paused, and for a moment, the silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. Then he added, almost shyly, "I'm glad I did." Sophie felt a warmth spread through her. There was something in the sincerity of his words, a quiet honesty that made her want to know more about him. To understand the life he had lived, the person he had become. She realized with a mix of surprise and hesitation that she was curious in a way she hadn't expected. Not just curious about him, but about the dynamic this unexpected encounter had introduced into her life. They moved into the living room, where the morning sunlight streamed through large windows, highlighting the gentle dust motes floating in the air. Sophie sank into the couch, feeling the softness beneath her and the quiet comfort of being in a familiar space. Ethan sat across from her, his posture relaxed but attentive. He didn't fidget, didn't glance away, he simply observed her, as if trying to piece together something he couldn't yet name. "Do you always stay here alone with Lila?" Sophie asked casually, though her heart raced slightly. Ethan shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Not always. I usually come by after school or work, but she didn't tell me you were visiting. 'Twas a surprise for both of us." His voice was steady, but there was a trace of nervousness in the way he avoided direct eye contact for a moment. Sophie found it endearing, and it made her feel less alone in her own nervous excitement. For hours they talked. They shared small stories about childhood memories, their favorite books, and the strange coincidences of life that had led them to this moment. Sophie learned that Ethan was thoughtful, introspective, and unexpectedly witty. He had a calm way of seeing the world, noticing details that others overlooked, and a subtle charm that drew people in without trying. Sophie felt herself relaxing, laughing more freely than she had in weeks. And yet there was a constant awareness of the complexity of the situation. Despite the ease of conversation, Sophie couldn't ignore the tension that lingered beneath the surface. It was subtle, a quiet electricity that sparked with every glance and every shared smile. She found herself thinking about Ethan even when she wasn't looking at him, wondering what he was thinking, what he felt, and whether he sensed the pull. She couldn't fully understand. At one point, Ethan leaned back, studying her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "Sophie, can I ask you something?" he said, his voice low and careful. Sophie nodded, curious and a little apprehensive. "Do you ever feel like you meet someone and it feels like you've known them longer than you actually have?" Sophie paused, considering her answer. There was something in his tone that made her heart beat faster, a vulnerability that matched the unexpected longing she felt in her own chest. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I've felt that before, though it's rare. Why do you ask?" Ethan shrugged lightly, but his eyes never left hers. "I don't know. Maybe it's just me. But when I saw you last night, I felt something I can't explain." Sophie felt a sudden rush of warmth, a mix of excitement and uncertainty. She didn't know what to say, how to respond, or what the next step should be. All she knew was that the weekend she had imagined as a quiet, simple escape had become something much more complex, charged with emotion, intrigue, and a sense of possibility she hadn't anticipated. The afternoon passed quickly. They moved outside to the garden, where the sunlight filtered through leaves, casting dappled shadows on the grass. Birds sang softly in the background, and the gentle rustle of leaves created a peaceful soundtrack to their conversation. They walked slowly, side by side, talking about dreams, regrets, and the small moments that shaped their lives. Sophie found herself sharing thoughts she hadn't shared with anyone in a long time. And Ethan listened with a patience and attention that made her feel truly understood. There was a subtle intimacy in the way they moved through the garden together, a quiet connection that neither fully named but both felt deeply. Sophie realized that the magnetic pull she had noticed the night before was not merely curiosity, was something more profound, something rooted in understanding, recognition, and a gentle longing neither of them could yet define. Evening approached, and the sky turned a soft shade of pink and orange. Sophie and Ethan sat on a bench near the edge of the garden, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The moment felt suspended in time, delicate and fleeting, yet charged with an emotional resonance that made it impossible to ignore. They talked quietly, occasionally laughing at small jokes, occasionally pausing in thoughtful silence. Each glance, each smile, carried unspoken questions and the possibility of something more. When Leela called them in for dinner, Sophie felt a strange reluctance to leave the garden. She realized she didn't want the moment to end, didn't want the quiet connection to be interrupted. But she followed Ethan back inside. And though the conversation at the table was polite and casual, the tension between them lingered. It was subtle, almost invisible to an outsider, but Sophie felt it in every glance, every shift in posture, every brief touch of hands when passing plates or utensils. Later that night, Sophie lay in the guest room again, her thoughts racing. She replayed every word, every glance, every fleeting touch. She realized that Ethan had affected her in ways she didn't fully understand, awakening emotions she hadn't anticipated. Curiosity, excitement, longing, and a quiet, tender admiration. She knew that the weekend held more surprises, more conversations, more moments that could either deepen this connection or leave it unspoken, lingering like a gentle ache in her chest. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, painting the guest room in golden hues. Sophie stirred awake, her mind still swirling with the events of the previous day. The conversations with Ethan, the quiet walks in the garden, the subtle tension in every glance, they all replayed in her mind like fragments of a dream she didn't want to forget. She felt a mix of excitement and apprehension, knowing that today might change everything. After a quick shower and a simple breakfast with Lila, Sophie found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at the sunlight dancing on the wooden floor. Ethan was nearby, tidying up the table. His movements were calm and deliberate, and the way he focused on small tasks reminded Sophie of someone who cared deeply about details others overlooked. She noticed the slight furrow of his brow as he concentrated and the small smile that appeared when he looked up and met her eyes. There was an unspoken connection between them, one that had grown steadily over the past day. "Do you want to walk in the garden again?" Ethan asked quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, steady, but there was a subtle nervousness she could detect. Sophie nodded, feeling her heart quicken at the invitation. She followed him out to the garden where the flowers swayed gently in the morning breeze. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of fresh grass and blooming jasmine. Every step they took seemed deliberate yet casual, as if they were both carefully navigating the delicate new world forming between them. They walked in silence for a while, enjoying the quiet and the warmth of the sun. Sophie felt a strange calmness, a sense that everything was exactly as it should be. Yet she couldn't shake the fluttering in her chest every time Ethan glanced her way. When he finally spoke, it was with a hesitancy that made her heart beat faster. "I don't usually say things like this," he began, pausing to gather his words. "But I feel like I've known you longer than I should have. Since last night, it's been different. I can't explain it, but being around you feels important." Sophie stopped walking for a moment, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She studied his face, noting the vulnerability hidden beneath his calm exterior. There was no arrogance, no pretension, just honesty. She realized that she felt the same way, a connection she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. "I feel it too," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why or how, but being here with you feels different from anything I've felt in a long time." Her words hung in the air, fragile yet full of meaning. Ethan's gaze softened, and a small smile played on his lips, the kind that made her heart skip a beat. They continued walking, this time side by side, each lost in their thoughts. Sophie noticed the way the sunlight highlighted the strands of his hair, the gentle curve of his smile, and the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. She realized that these small details, unnoticed by others, mattered to her now in a way she hadn't expected. Every movement, every glance, every pause between words carried a weight she couldn't fully articulate. Eventually, they found themselves seated on a wooden bench under a large oak tree, the branches stretching out above them like a protective canopy. Ethan turned to face her, his expression serious but gentle. "Sophie, I don't want to rush anything," he said, his tone careful. but I need to be honest about how I feel. Since I saw you, I've felt a connection I can't ignore. I don't know what it means yet, but I want to explore it." Sophie felt her breath catch. The truth in his words mirrored her own thoughts, her own hidden longing. She wanted to tell him everything she felt, the curiosity, the excitement, the unexpected warmth that had grown inside her since she arrived. But the words seemed inadequate, fragile against the depth of emotion she was experiencing. Instead, she simply reached out and placed her hand lightly over his. The touch was gentle, tentative, yet it spoke volumes. Ethan's eyes softened further, and he took a small breath, closing the distance slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. "That means more than I can say." Sophie felt her chest tighten, a mix of nervousness and exhilaration. It was as though the air between them had shifted, charged with possibility and understanding. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of meaning. Birds chirped in the distance, and the rustling of leaves created a soft, natural melody around them. Sophie felt a profound sense of calm, a rare clarity amidst the emotional storm she had been navigating. She realized that sometimes words weren't necessary. That connection, honesty, and presence could convey more than any conversation could. Eventually, Ethan spoke again, his voice low and reflective. "Sophie, do you ever wonder if life brings certain people into your world for a reason, even when it's unexpected?" Sophie nodded, thinking carefully about her answer. "Yes," she said softly. "I think some encounters are meant to challenge us, change us, or open doors we didn't even know existed. Meeting you feels like one of those moments." Ethan's gaze softened further, and he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was tender, intimate, yet entirely appropriate, reflecting the trust and vulnerability growing between them. Sophie's heart raced, but she felt safe, understood, and inexplicably drawn to him. As the afternoon wore on, they explored the small garden paths, sharing memories of childhood, dreams for the future, and the small fears they rarely voiced. Sophie discovered that Ethan was thoughtful, kind, and unexpectedly wise for his age. He had a way of seeing the world that resonated deeply with her own experiences, and she felt an increasing admiration for his perspective, his calmness, and his ability to listen without judgment. When Lila called them in for lunch, Sophie felt a pang of reluctance. She didn't want the moment to end, didn't want the delicate connection to be interrupted. But as they returned inside, she realized that these feelings weren't fleeting, they were real, tangible, and growing stronger by the hour. She glanced at Ethan as they passed through the hallway, and he met her eyes with a gentle smile that spoke volumes. The rest of the day passed in a mix of quiet moments and shared laughter. They cooked together, prepared snacks, and found ways to keep each other entertained with playful teasing and subtle jokes. Every interaction was charged with unspoken meaning, and Sophie felt the thrill of anticipation in everything they did. Yet there was no rush, no pressure, just a natural unfolding of emotions, conversations, and shared experiences that deepened their connection. As evening approached, they returned to the garden once more, this time sitting on the grass under the soft glow of the setting sun. The sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and lavender, creating a breathtaking backdrop for the quiet intimacy forming between them. Sophie leaned back slightly, her eyes fixed on the horizon, and felt Ethan's presence beside her, steady and reassuring. "I'm glad you came," Ethan said quietly, his voice almost reverent. "I don't know what this means yet, but I know that I want to explore it slowly, carefully, and honestly." Sophie turned to look at him, her heart swelling with emotion. "Me too," she replied softly. "I don't have all the answers, and I don't know what will happen, but I know that being here with you, it feels right." They stayed there for a long while, talking, sharing dreams, and simply enjoying the quiet intimacy of being together. Sophie realized that the connection they were forming wasn't just about attraction or curiosity, was about understanding, respect, and the gradual unfolding of trust and vulnerability. She felt herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. And she sensed that Ethan felt the same. Night fell, and the garden was bathed in the soft silver glow of the moon. Stars twinkled above, and the air carried a gentle chill. They stood, to return inside, walking slowly, their hands brushing occasionally, sending subtle shivers down Sophie's spine. The moment was delicate, charged with emotion, and entirely theirs. Back in the living room, they paused before parting ways for the night. Sophie looked at Ethan, seeing the depth of feeling in his eyes, and felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Good night," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Good night, Sophie," he replied softly. "Tomorrow. We'll see where this goes." His words carried hope, possibility, and a quiet promise that lingered in the room long after he left. Sophie lay in her guest room that night, thinking about the day, the connection she had felt, and the emotions that had surfaced. She realized that this weekend, which had begun as a simple visit, had transformed into something far more profound. It wasn't just about curiosity or attraction, it was about discovering a bond, quiet understanding, and the possibility of something meaningful emerging from unexpected circumstances. As sleep finally took her, Sophie felt a sense of anticipation. She didn't know what the future held or how the connection with Ethan would unfold, but she felt certain that this experience had changed her. The quiet moments, the gentle confessions, the shared glances, they were all part of a story that was still being written, one filled with hope, emotion, and the delicate beginnings of something beautiful.